county hall smelled of dust and old varnish. Its benches creaked under the weight of farmers, land speculators, and curious townsfolk who had gathered for the yearly tax auction. It was the kind of day when land that no one wanted, broken houses, and forgotten pieces of forest were sold for whatever someone was willing to risk. The auctioneer, an old man with a booming voice, read through his long list, one property after another. Farms with too many taxes, fields where nothing grew anymore, and houses already falling apart. Each time someone raised a hand, another shook a head, coins changed hands, and the room buzzed with excitement and whispers. But when the auctioneer cleared his throat and announced the next lot, the room fell strangely quiet. Abandoned cabin in Pine Hollow, back taxes, 25 cents, he said, his lips twitching as if even he found the listing ridiculous. Laughter erupted across the room. One man shouted, "Worth less than the wood for the fire." Another added, "You'd have to pay me to take it." Even the clerk smirked as he scribbled the number on his paper. For years the cabin had been nothing but a story, a broken shack deep in the hollow where no one cared to go. People said the roof sagged, the porch leaned like an old drunk, and that snakes lived under the floorboards. No one had touched it in decades. To most it was a joke, not property. But at the back of the hall, a man sat quietly, his clothes plain, his boots scuffed, his eyes steady. He had come not to laugh but to listen. When the words Pine Hollow filled the air, something inside him shifted, a strange pull he could not explain. It was as if the land itself called his name. He did not think of money or laughter, only of the feeling that this cabin wanted him. Before he could stop himself, his hand rose, slow but certain. The room hushed, then burst again into laughter. "The fool's wasting his coin," one farmer chuckled. "Better off buying a pile of ashes." The auctioneer banged his gavel, amused but unshaken. "Sold, 25 cents. The man stood, walked to the front, and placed a single quarter on the desk. The clerk barely looked at him as he slid over the yellow slip of ownership, muttering, "Yours now, good luck with the rats." The man folded the paper carefully, placed it in his pocket, and walked out under the afternoon sun. The mocking voices fading behind him, he should have felt embarrassed, but instead his chest felt strangely light, as if a heavy key had been placed there. That night he sat at his kitchen table staring at the yellow slip, the words abandoned cabin glowing in the lamplight. He whispered to himself, "They laughed, but something waits there." The next morning he loaded his old truck with a lantern, some tools, a small bundle of food, and drove down the winding road that led into Pine Hollow. The path narrowed until trees pressed against his windows, branches scratching the paint. The air grew colder, thicker, as if the forest itself tested him. Finally he reached a clearing, and there it was, the cabin, leaning against time, its roof sagging, windows cracked, porch tilted, vines crawling over the walls, yet standing, stubborn against years of neglect. He climbed out of the truck, his boots sinking into damp earth, and the moment he stepped onto the clearing he felt it again. That pull, stronger now, deep and steady. Like the land itself was alive beneath his feet. He walked closer, touched the porch post, the wood soft with rot, but warm, strangely warm, not like dead wood should be. Inside, dust covered everything, cobwebs hung from the rafters. Sunlight cut through the cracks in sharp lines. The fireplace was filled with cold ash. The floor groaned with each step, but he did not feel fear or regret. He felt welcome, as if the cabin had been waiting for him. He sat on the broken chair by the hearth, listening to the silence, not empty silence, but silence that hummed low and deep, almost like a voice too old to speak words. He knew then that his 25 cents had bought more than a shack. It had bought a secret, something the others could not see. He stayed until evening, fixing a broken shutter, clearing branches from the roof. The forest around him whispered with the sound of leaves. A crow cried from the trees, and he felt at home in a place everyone else had abandoned. When night fell he lit his lantern, set it on the crooked table, and unrolled the yellow slip once more. His fingers brushed its edges, and he whispered, "You're mine now." Outside the wind rose, the trees groaned, and the ground beneath the cabin gave a faint deep rumble, as if answering him. He did not laugh, he did not fear, he only smiled faintly, because he understood now that what he had bought was not worthless, it was alive, and it had chosen him. The first night he spent inside the cabin tested him more than any auction hall laughter ever could. The roof leaked in thin streams with every burst of rain. The wind hissed through the broken slats in the walls, and the floor groaned with each step as if complaining about being disturbed after so many years. He lay on his blanket near the cold fireplace, staring at the ceiling while the lantern's glow flickered weakly. Sleep came in small pieces, broken by every creak, every shift of wood, and every whistle of air moving through unseen cracks, yet instead of fear, he felt a strange kind of watchfulness, as though the hollow itself was paying attention to him. Morning came grey and damp, sunlight spilling in thin lines across the floor. He pushed open the cabin door, the hinges crying out, and stepped into the clearing where mist clung low to the grass. The trees stood tall and silent as if guarding the land. He circled the cabin slowly, taking in its leaning porch, the sagging roof, and the vines that curled like snakes around its walls. Most men would have shaken their heads, cursed their quarter wasted, and walked away, but he felt something else, a stubborn resolve. The cabin might be broken, but it breathed, it waited, and he would not abandon it. He spent the day working, clearing brush from the porch, cutting away vines, patching holes with spare wood. His hands blistered, his back ached. But with every strike of the hammer the cabin seemed to shift, less like ruin and more like something waking from sleep. Neighbors passing on the far road slowed to watch. Some laughed, some shouted, "Still. Think it's worth a quarter. Don't let it fall on your head." He ignored them, their voices only fuel for his resolve. When the sun dipped behind the trees he carried his lantern upstairs. The narrow steps groaned as he climbed to the attic, dust thick in the air, beams low and heavy. He pushed aside old boxes, cobwebs breaking across his arms. And then he noticed a loose board in the far corner. His heart quickened as he pulled it away. Beneath lay a bundle wrapped in old cloth, brittle with age. He carried it down to the table and unfolded it slowly. Inside were maps drawn in ink, survey lines, notes scribbled in faded handwriting, county seals stamped faintly at the corners. Deeds so old they looked ready to crumble. He read through them with wide eyes, realizing that the land described was larger than the clearing, larger than the cabin itself, stretching toward the lake, land valuable in ways those laughing neighbors could not imagine. He leaned back in his chair, the lantern light casting long shadows across the walls, his heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and wonder. He whispered to himself, "This isn't just wood and stone, it's something more." Outside the forest stirred as if it had heard him. A long low groan rolled through the ground, like distant thunder underground. He did not flinch, he only tightened his grip on the papers, because he knew then that his 25 cents had not bought him a joke. It had bought him a secret worth far more than anyone could guess. As the night deepened he spread the maps across the table, tracing the lines with his finger, following the boundaries toward the water, imagining what it meant. His eyes heavy with exhaustion but his mind burning with possibilities. The cabin creaked above him, the forest sighed outside, and though he was alone, he felt less lonely than he had in years, as if the land itself had accepted him, as if it had been waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to see its worth. He blew out the lantern, lay back on the floor, and drifted into uneasy sleep, the papers safe beneath his arm. And in his dreams he saw the lake glowing under the moon, whispering promises of wealth and danger that would soon change everything. The storm rolled into Pine Hollow 3 nights later, black clouds pressing down on the trees, lightning flashing across the sky so bright it turned the cabin into a skeleton of beams and shadow. Rain slammed against the sagging roof, forcing him to set out pans and buckets to catch the steady leaks. Wind screamed through the broken shutters, making the lantern flame bend low as if it would die at any second. He sat by the fireplace staring at the bundle of papers he had found, his fingers tracing the faded ink of the maps, each line a promise that the land beneath him was far more valuable than the neighbors believed. Thunder rattled the floorboards and in the attic a beam cracked loud. So he climbed the stairs with his lantern, pushing through the dust and cobwebs, his boots thudding on the warped planks. The attic smelled of old wood and mildew, boxes lay half-collapsed, trunks with rusted hinges, and the broken mirror that leaned against the wall reflected his pale face in the lantern glow. As lightning lit the sky outside, he saw strange carvings etched into the beams, circles and lines that seemed to glow for a heartbeat before fading back into shadow. His breath caught as he ran his hand over them. The wood warm beneath his fingers though the air was cold. He pulled open one of the crates and inside found brittle papers tied with string, deeds stamped with county seals, receipts of ownership, survey notes describing mineral rights and water boundaries. His heart thudded faster. Here was proof stronger than anything. This cabin and the land around it was not just his by auction slip. It was bound to him by law older than most remembered. Thunder cracked so loud it rattled his bones, and he carried the trunk down the stairs, stacking the papers on the crooked table. The storm howled outside, but he barely heard it. He read until his eyes blurred. Journals filled with shaky handwriting. Describing the hollow, notes about the lake and old deals with surveyors. One line underlined twice. Lakefront rights secured in perpetuity. The words struck him harder than the thunder, because they meant the shoreline itself belonged to whoever owned the cabin. And that meant him. He leaned back, lantern light dancing on the walls, his mind racing as he realized the land was not worthless. It was a hidden fortune. Morning came gray and dripping. The storm gone, but the ground soaked. Mist. Rising off the hollow like breath, he carried one of the maps outside, following its faded lines through the trees until he reached the lake. The water lay still, glassy and endless, and he stood at the edge with the paper trembling in his hand. The boundary marks matched the shoreline perfectly. His boots sank into damp earth that was his, stretching farther than he had ever dreamed. He stared at the calm water, feeling the pull stronger than ever. The cabin had not been a mistake. It had been waiting for someone to uncover its truth. He whispered into the morning air, "They laughed at me, but they don't know." The lake rippled faintly though no wind blew, as if answering, and he felt both exhilaration and dread. For he understood that a 25-cent joke had become a prize worth millions. And prizes like that never stayed hidden for long. Sooner or later others would see, and when they did, they would not laugh. They would come with hands outstretched and teeth bared. And the first to arrive would not be strangers. It would be those who always hungered for control. Those who called themselves the HOA. Word about the cabin spread like fire through dry grass. At first it was only whispers at the diner and the gas station. People saying the man who had bought a worthless shack for a quarter was still living in it, patching its roof and clearing brush. Then curiosity grew when survey trucks were seen parked near the hollow. Men with clipboards and cameras pacing the tree line. Then came the reporters. First a local paper that printed a photo of him standing on the leaning porch. Headline calling him the man with the quarter cabin. Neighbors laughed again. But this time the laughter carried unease, because along with the story came a detail that could not be ignored. Old deeds and surveys hinted that his land touched the lakefront. Land now crawling with developers eager to build luxury homes and resorts. Offers began arriving. One man in a polished suit drove up in a shining car, stepping onto the sagging porch with a smile too sharp. He laid down a check for $2 million, his voice smooth. "Take it, you'll never see money like this again." But the man only shook his head and pushed the paper back, his voice quiet but firm. "It's not for sale." More offers followed, higher and higher, until the whispers turned into envy and resentment. Neighbors who had once called him a fool now watched from their polished decks with narrowed eyes. Some waved as if they were friends, others muttered that he didn't deserve such luck. He ignored them, working on the cabin day after day, repairing walls, setting new beams, keeping the place alive. But he could not ignore what came next, because with fortune came danger. One evening as the sun bled red across the lake he found an envelope nailed to his door, the paper crisp, the ink neat, stamped with 3 bold letters, HOA. He unfolded it slowly, the words written in polite yet cutting tone. "Dear resident, this property now falls under the jurisdiction of the Pine Lake Homeowners Association. As a member you are required to comply with community rules and dues. Failure to comply may result in forfeiture of property rights." His jaw tightened as he read, his fist closing around the paper. He had never signed up for an association. He had never agreed to anything but the coin he dropped at the auction. Yet here they were, claiming his land with nothing more than ink and arrogance. He crumpled the letter and tossed it into the fire, telling himself it was nonsense. But in his chest he felt the first chill of warning. Days later more letters arrived. Thicker, more demanding, claiming unpaid dues, listing violations like broken windows and an unpainted porch. Then came the men, driving shiny trucks with logos on their doors, board members they called themselves, stepping onto his land with smiles that hid sharpened teeth. One of them said smoothly, "We appreciate your cooperation, but you should know this property is under our management now." He stood tall in the doorway, holding the auction slip in one hand and the survey papers in the other, his voice steady. "I bought this land fair. I found its proof. It is mine, not yours." They only smiled, their eyes cold. "We'll see," one said, and they left, their tires spitting dirt as they drove away. He stood on the porch long after they were gone, the cabin creaking behind him, the woods whispering in the wind, and in that moment he knew the real fight had begun. The laughter at the auction had been easy to endure, But this was different. Greed wrapped in rules and power, polished and smiling, and it was far more dangerous than mockery. He clenched his fists and whispered into the night. You chose me, and I won't let them take you. The hollow seemed to answer with a low groan of the earth, as if promising it would stand with him, even against the HOA. The pressure came fast and heavy. The HOA wasted no time showing its teeth. Letters arrived every week, each one stamped in red, words like final notice and mandatory fees printed across the top. They claimed he owed thousands in back dues, fines for violations like broken shutters, unpainted siding, even for keeping firewood stacked too close to the porch. At first he ignored them, tossing the envelopes into the fire until the smoke carried their threats into the sky. But ignoring only seemed to make them bolder. One morning he woke to the sound of footsteps outside. 3 men in dark jackets walking his property with clipboards, measuring the porch, taking pictures of the windows. When he stepped out and asked what they were doing, one of them smiled thinly and said, documenting community code violations. His blood boiled. He told them this wasn't community land. This was his, bought with his own hand. But they only shrugged and said, the HOA has jurisdiction now, you'll learn to comply. Before climbing into their black truck and driving away, that night he could not sleep. He sat at the table with the old deeds spread in front of him, tracing the faded stamps with his fingers, whispering to himself that this was real proof. The cabin was his, the land was his, and no group of men could erase it with papers full of lies. But deep down he knew they were not fighting with truth. They were fighting with power, the kind that dragged people through endless hearings until they broke. Within a week the threats grew stronger. A sheriff's deputy came with 2 board members and handed him a packet claiming his land was under community control. They demanded he vacate within 30 days. His hands shook but his voice stayed firm as he pulled out the auction slip, the county-certified deeds, and the survey maps he had found in the attic. The deputy studied them long, his brow furrowing, then said quietly that the matter would have to go to court, not end with eviction. The board members' smug smiles cracked at that, their eyes cold as they climbed back into their truck, one of them rolling down the window to hiss, enjoy it while it lasts, because soon it's ours. The cabin stood silent behind him, its beams groaning in the wind as though sharing his anger. The following nights grew darker. Cars parked on the road with headlights off, watching. His tools began to vanish from the shed. Once he found his door kicked open. Nothing taken but everything disturbed, a warning more than a robbery. He started keeping the lantern burning late into the night. The papers always spread before him on the table, as if the glow itself could guard them. One evening, just as the sun slid behind the trees, an old man knocked on his door, his back bent but his eyes sharp. He introduced himself as a retired county clerk who had read about the fight in the paper. He warned him that HOAs had money, lawyers, and the patience to wear a man down. They'll try to bury you in paper until you surrender. The old man said, then slid a thin folder across the table. But you have something they don't, truth. Inside were past cases, rulings where HOAs had lost when deeds were strong. His heart steadied as he flipped through them. The old man left soon after, his last words lingering. Don't let them scare you, son. The law is on your side if you stand long enough. He sat by the fire long into the night, the cabin creaking around him, the forest humming low, his fists clenched, his resolve stronger than ever. The HOA wanted to steal his quarter cabin, but they had underestimated the one thing more stubborn than greed, his will to fight, and the land that seemed to rise with him. The fight deepened like roots twisting under the soil. The HOA no longer hid behind polite letters. Now they sent thick envelopes stamped with court threats, words heavy with legal weight meant to frighten him into surrender. Each page demanded money, demanded compliance, demanded silence. But he did not yield. Every evening he spread the deeds and maps across the table, the old ink glowing in the lantern light like a shield. He traced the county seals with his finger, reminding himself that what he held was stronger than any of their paper tricks. Still the pressure grew. One afternoon while he repaired the roof, the growl of engines echoed through the hollow. 3 black SUVs rolled into the clearing. Doors opened and men in pressed suits stepped out, their shoes sinking into the mud. They looked out of place in the wild trees, yet their confidence was sharp. One of them called out, his voice smooth but cutting. We're here on behalf of the Pine Lake Homeowners Association. You're in violation of multiple codes and fees. This property is under our authority. The man climbed down from the roof slowly, the hammer still in his hand, sweat streaking his face. He said nothing at first, only walked to the porch and unrolled the yellow slip from the auction, holding it up high. Then he spread the brittle maps across the table inside and pointed at the county seals, his voice steady. "This land is mine, every inch of it. No HOA owns a thing here." The suited men smirked, one leaning closer, whispering just loud enough for him to hear. "The law bends to power, and we have both." Then they turned and left, their SUVs rumbling away, leaving only the echo of their arrogance behind. That night he could not rest. He lit the fire and read through the attic journals again. Desperate for more than just ownership, desperate for something undeniable. And there he found it. A note scribbled in the margin of a surveyor's log. Lakefront rights secured in perpetuity, mineral claims pending. His eyes widened, his pulse quickened. These words meant the land was not only his, but the very lakefront the HOA had built its empire upon could belong to him. He imagined their polished homes and shiny docks all resting on ground that was legally tied to his quarter cabin. The thought filled him with equal parts dread and power. Because if this was true, the HOA's foundation was nothing but sand. The next morning he drove into the county records office, the old truck rattling as he parked in front of the courthouse. Clerks raised their eyebrows when he dropped the bundle of papers on the counter, demanding verification. Hours passed as dusty books and reels were pulled, the clerks whispering as they checked line after line. Finally one handed him a fresh certified copy with a faint smile. "It's valid, sir, these claims stand." He left with the papers tucked close to his chest, his boots striking hard against the courthouse steps. When he returned to the cabin that evening, another sign had been staked in his yard. Community property, no trespassing. Nailed deep into the soil as if mocking him, rage surged through him. He ripped it out and hurled it into the woods, his voice rising into the twilight. "This is mine, you can't take it." The trees groaned in the wind as though answering, and the cabin stood behind him like a silent ally. He knew then the war would not be won with silence, it would be won in the open, in the courtroom, where truth would stand against greed. He tightened his grip on the papers, the fire of determination in his chest, and whispered to the hollow, "Let them come, I'm ready." The battle moved from the hollow to the courthouse, but the weight of it pressed on him every day. The HOA board filed motion after motion, each one thicker than the last, each one meant to drain his strength. Neighbors whispered that he should give up, take the money and leave, but he refused, because the cabin was more than wood, more than land. It was proof that greed could be fought. The morning of the first hearing he drove his rattling truck into town, the back seat stacked with folders of deeds, maps, and journals. When he entered the courtroom, the benches were already full, board members in polished suits sat together. Their smug faces turned toward him with mocking smiles. The HOA president leaned back in his chair like a king waiting for a peasant to beg. Their lawyer stood tall, his voice smooth as he painted a picture of community order and legal codes, claiming the man was nothing but a squatter on land governed by their association. Whispers spread through the room. But when it was his turn he walked slowly to the front, unrolling the yellow slip from the auction, his voice steady though his hands trembled. "I paid for this cabin, fair and legal, my name is in the county ledger." Then he laid down the old deeds, the survey maps stamped with fading seals, and the journals describing lakefront rights. The judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed, asking pointed questions the HOA lawyer could not answer. Each word chipped away at the smugness of the board, their smiles faltering, their whispers turning sharp. When the hearing ended, no final ruling came, only a delay. But the weight in the room had shifted, the crowd leaving with murmurs that the quarter cabin might truly stand. Outside the courthouse the HOA president confronted him, his voice low and venomous. "This isn't over, we'll bury you in paper until you crawl away." But the man only met his eyes and said quietly, "You can't bury the truth." Back at the cabin he stacked the papers on the table once more, the lantern light flickering over his determined face. Night pressed heavy against the windows, the forest silent except for the groan of trees. He sat long into the dark listening to the hum in the ground. The same hum he had felt since the day he first stepped onto the porch. The land seemed to whisper that it had seen worse battles and survived, and so would he. Cars still came at night, headlights cutting across the clearing, watching, waiting. But he did not hide, he stood in the doorway, his figure lit by the lantern behind him, unshaken, because he knew the real storm was coming, the final hearing that would decide everything, and he would be ready when it did. The final hearing arrived on a cold morning. The kind of day when the air itself felt sharp. He drove his old truck into town with the cabin's papers stacked neatly beside him, his boots heavy as he climbed the courthouse steps. Inside the courtroom, every bench was packed. Neighbors, reporters, investors, and strangers all waiting to see how the story of the quarter cabin would end. The HOA board sat together in the front row, their polished suits pressed, their lawyer smirking with confidence. The president of the board leaned back in his chair, whispering to those beside him as if victory was already certain. When the judge entered the room, silence fell like a hammer. The HOA lawyer stood first, his words flowing smooth and practiced. He spoke of community responsibility, codes, appearances, and order, twisting the story to make it seem as though the cabin was never his, that it belonged to the association. His voice rose as he painted the man as a stubborn squatter holding progress hostage. The board members nodded, smug smiles spreading as if the outcome was decided. But then it was his turn. He walked to the front slowly, each step echoing in the quiet room, his hands steady though his heart thundered. He laid the yellow auction slip on the table before the judge, his voice clear. "I bought this cabin for 25 cents. My name is in the county ledger." Then he unrolled the brittle survey maps, spreading them wide so the old stamps and signatures gleamed in the light. He held up the journals with their shaky handwriting describing the lakefront rights, his words simple, not polished like the lawyers, but heavy with truth. "This land has been mine since the day no one else wanted it. Their association cannot claim what they never owned." The room shifted. Whispers growing, the judge leaned forward, his eyes scanning the documents. The HOA lawyer tried to interrupt, shouting about codes and violations. But the judge raised a hand to silence him. His gavel tapped once, the sound sharp, then he spoke in a voice that carried through every corner. "This deed is valid. The surveys are binding. The ownership stands with him. The HOA has no claim." Gasps filled the chamber. The board members went pale. Some shouted in protest. But the gavel struck again. Louder. "Enough, this matter is settled, and this court warns the association against further harassment." The board members left stiff and furious, their empire cracked wide open. Reporters rushed to the steps as he walked out, their questions flying like arrows, but he said nothing, only held the yellow slip and the survey papers tight in his hands. The sun hit his face as he stepped into the open air, and for the first time since the auction, he felt the weight of victory. Back at the hollow, the cabin stood quiet, its porch still leaning, its beams still creaking, but it no longer felt fragile. It felt like a fortress. He sat on the porch as evening fell, the lake shining in the distance, the wind moving softly through the trees. The fight was over. The cabin was his, and no one could take it now. From 25 cents to $10 million, from laughter to envy, from threats to triumph, he had held on to what was his. And in the end, the land itself seemed to breathe easier. The hum beneath the earth no longer a warning, but an approval. He whispered into the twilight, "We did it." And the hollow answered with silence deep and calm, as if it had always known. The days after the ruling felt unreal. The cabin sat in silence as if it too was recovering from the storm. The news spread across the county like wildfire. Every diner, every bar, every front porch carried the same story. The man who bought a broken shack for a quarter had beaten the HOA in court and held land now worth $10 million. Reporters came in waves, some begging for interviews, others snapping photos of the leaning porch and crooked chimney. Neighbors who had once mocked him now stopped at the edge of the clearing, some offering awkward congratulations, others trying to mask their envy behind tight smiles. Investors returned as well, their cars shining under the hollow's trees, but their voices were sharper now, not mocking but hungry. One man pushed across a check for $5 million. Another for $7 million, one even promised $10 million, all begging him to sell, to leave the fight behind and take the fortune. But he only shook his head each time, his voice steady. "I didn't buy this land to sell it. I bought it because it was mine." The rejected offers spread more gossip, some calling him a fool, others calling him a legend. The HOA board, humiliated in the courtroom, tried to lick its wounds in silence. But anger festered in their shadows. Rumors spread that they wanted revenge, that they would try again under new tactics, fines disguised as county codes, pressure through back channels, and he knew deep down the war was not fully finished. Still, the cabin felt different now. Its beams groaned with pride rather than weakness. Its porch stood firmer after his repairs, and at night the hum in the ground was no longer ominous. It was steady, like the heartbeat of something alive and ancient. One evening as the sun bled orange over the lake, he climbed the hill behind the cabin. Looking down at the water glowing gold, he imagined the future, docks, resorts, mansions crowding the shore. But at the center of it all stood his cabin, small but unmovable. He realized then that he wasn't just holding land, he was holding history, the kind of truth that money could never replace. When he returned to the porch that night, an envelope waited on the steps, no stamp, no address, only words scratched in ink, "This isn't over." He burned it in the fire without a second glance. The flames curling around the paper until it was ash, he stared into the firelight and whispered, "It's already over, you just don't know it yet." Outside the trees swayed in the night wind, the hollow breathing with him, the cabin creaking like it agreed. And though he knew the HOA would never forget the humiliation, he also knew they could never erase what was written in law and in the land itself. The quarter deal had turned into a war, and he had won. Not by selling, not by bending, but by standing. The cabin was his, the land was his, and no threat could ever change that truth. The cabin stood tall in its crooked way, no longer a joke whispered at auctions or a burden mocked by neighbors. It had become a symbol, a reminder that one man's stubbornness and a single quarter could change everything. The land around Pine Hollow buzzed with new life, construction on the far side of the lake, wealthy families building glass mansions and resorts rising with polished docks. But no matter how much money poured into the area, all eyes still drifted back to the old cabin at the edge of the hollow. The cabin that refused to be taken. The man spent his days repairing it slowly, not to sell or impress, but because he wanted it strong. Every nail driven into the beams felt like defiance. Every board replaced was a promise. In town people looked at him differently now, some with admiration, some with envy, and some with quiet fear. For he had stood against the HOA and won. And such victories were rare. Reporters still came, their questions circling around the same idea. Why not sell? Why not take the money? And his answer was always the same. Because this land is mine, and some things are worth more than money. Those words spread, printed in headlines, repeated in cafes, whispered on porches, and soon strangers began driving past the hollow just to catch a glimpse of the quarter cabin. The HOA tried one last time to challenge him, slipping new notices into his mailbox, claiming new rules, hinting at new fines. But when he brought those to the county, the officials only shook their heads. The court's ruling was clear. The HOA's reach ended at his property line. Their power broken, their arrogance shattered, board members resigned, their meetings grew empty, and their threats died like embers in rain. One evening he sat on the porch as the sun sank over the lake, the sky painted in gold and purple, the cabin creaking softly as if breathing beside him. He thought back to the day of the auction, the laughter that had filled the hall when he raised his hand for the worthless shack, the quarter clinking on the desk, the clerk muttering good luck with the rats, and he smiled, because they had all been wrong. That coin had bought him more than land. It had bought him a story, a fight, a victory that no one could take away. As the crickets sang and the trees swayed, he whispered to the hollow, "We did it." And the low hum in the ground answered, steady and calm, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. From 25 cents to $10 million, from ridicule to triumph. The cabin stood not as a prize but as proof. Proof that truth cannot be stolen. Proof that greed can be beaten. Proof that sometimes the smallest choices carry the greatest power. The night settled quiet and deep, stars flickering above the dark trees, and for the first time in years he felt completely at peace. The cabin was his, the land was his, and forever it would stand as the quarter cabin that no one could ever steal.